Buongiorno, buongiorno.
Good morning.
My name is Cecilia Alemani. I am the curator of the exhibition The Milk of Dreams. I'm very excited and honored to be here today and to welcome you for the very first of a 5-day event called Meetings on Art. It's a program that brings together amazing speakers that will talk about issues connected to the exhibition that you see in the Arsenale and in the Giardini. I would like to open with some words of gratitude. Thanks to all the speakers for accepting this invitation. Thank you all for being here, and also thanks to the many people that are connecting via streaming. I also want to thank the curatorial team of the Venice Biennale, Marta Papini, and in particular Manuela Hansen, who has been overseeing the entire production and conception of this event. The entire team of La Biennale di Venezia, in particular Jorn Brandmeier, Ilaria Zanella, Francesca Montorio. From today to Saturday, June 11th, every day at 10 a.m. and at 5 p.m. Central European Time, we will be hosting a series of keynote speeches, roundtable discussions, to renew conversation around the artist Leonora Carrington, who inspired the title and some of the themes of the exhibition. Bringing together 36 artists, scholars, curators, thinkers, and writers, the program takes Carrington as a point of departure to discuss broader topics in connection to the exhibition, such as the metamorphoses of the body, our relationships with technology and the earth, surrealism, the undoing of binary gender forms, indigenous epistemologies, the post-human turn, the practice of fabulation, and feminist approaches to curating. I would like to say a few words about the exhibition and Leonora Carrington before introducing our great speakers. As you probably know, the exhibition is titled The Milk of Dreams. It's a title that I appropriated from a very tiny book that Leonora composed in the late 40s and 50s when she wrote kids' stories for her own children on the walls of her apartment first, and then collected them in a little notebook when she moved to Mexico City, where she fled from Europe and from the Second World War. The mind-bending visions of hybrid mutant creatures that fill her fanciful universes include children who lose their heads, vultures trapped in gelatin, and carnivorous machines. Told in a dreamlike style that seemed to terrify young and old alike, Carrington's stories describe a magical world where life is constantly reimagined through the prism of imagination, and where everybody can change, be transformed, and become something or someone else. It's a world set free, brimming with possibilities. But it's also an allegory of a century that imposed intolerable pressure on the individual, forcing Carrington into a life of exile, locked up in mental hospitals, an eternal object of fascination and desire, yet also a figure of startling power and mystery, always fleeing the stricture of a fixed, coherent identity. When asked about her birth, Carrington would say she was the product of her mother's encounter with a machine in the same bizarre union of human, animal, and mechanical that marks much of her paintings and writing. The exhibition, The Milk of Dreams, takes Leonora Carrington, her otherworldly creatures, and many other figures of transformation as companion on an imaginary journey through metamorphoses of the body and definition of humanity. I'm thrilled of this morning's conversations about Leonora Carrington and the metamorphoses of the body, featuring Marina Warner and Joanna Moorhead, moderated by Angela Vettese. And now a few words to introduce our speakers. Marina Warner is a writer of fiction, criticism, and history. Her award-winning books explore myth and fairy tales. They include Alone of All Our Sex, The Myth and the Cult of the Virgin Mary, and Monuments and Maidens, The Allegory of the Female Form. She has published 5 novels and 3 collections of short stories. Her essays on literature and art include several on Leonora Carrington's writings. She has written Introduction to the House of Fear and The Seventh Horse, afterwards to The Debutante and Down Below. She's a professor of English and creative writing at Birkbeck College in London and a fellow of the British Academy. In 2015, she was awarded the Holberg Prize in the Arts and Humanities. Warner has also contributed to our exhibition catalog, which you can see on the table right there, with an original piece titled Viral Spiral, or 7 Twists in a Witch's Duel, where she presents 7 stories of metamorphic shape-shifting and commentary inspired by the pandemic. Joanna Moorhead is a journalist who writes for The Guardian, The Observer, and other UK newspapers and magazines. In 2006, she went to Mexico in search of her father's cousin, Leonora Carrington, who had disappeared from the family 70 years earlier. Having only expected to visit once, she returned many times. Moorhead's memoir about Carrington's story and their unlikely friendship, The Surreal Life of Leonora Carrington, is published by Virago. Angela Vettese is an art critic, curator, and associate professor of contemporary art at the Università UAV di Venezia, where she's also founded and directed since 2001 the MA course in visual arts. She has been a member of the Brussels Commissions and the European Research Council, curator at the Fondazione Antonio Ratti, director of the Galleria Civica di Modena, director of Fondazione Hernando Pomodoro di Milano, president of the Fondazione Bevilacqua La Masa here in Venice, and director of Arte Fiera Bologna. She co-curated shows and events in conjunction with La Biennale di Venezia, and she was president of its jury in 2009. She has published several books and essays. Marina Warner, Joanna Moorhead, and Angela Vettese will give a short presentation each and then have an inspiring conversation about Leonora Carrington and the themes of metamorphoses that run through the exhibition. They will open to questions towards the end, so please hold on them until the very end of the conversation, and hopefully we'll be wrapping around noon. I also want to quickly mention the next Meeting on Art event, which will take place today at 5 p.m. We will have philosopher Rosi Braidotti, artist Alexandra Pirici, and dealer and curator Jeffrey Deitch in conversation around the post-human turn. And now I would like to turn the microphone over to Angela Vettese, who will be moderating the discussion. Thank you very much, and if you need headphones for the translation, they're just over there. Thank you.
I'm flattered to be here with such an important parterre. Thank you, Cecilia Alemani, of course, who is the host of the three of us, and thank you, Marina Werner and Joanna Moorhead, for being here. This kind of presences is what still make Venice big. And so these two ladies are very important. They are two outstanding figures for the studies of Leonora Carrington, who have been focusing from two different points of view, but I would say with synergic results, then we will see. Let me take a handful of minutes to throw a couple of dice. What their presence means to me today, thanks to Cecilia intuitions and researchers, is a number of questions more than answers. What are the feasible, suitable, useful methods for studying contemporary art? How should we study contemporary art? We all know that while studying contemporary art, there are some points we cannot miss. First, if the artist is alive, he or she must be reached, talked with, befriended. If we can't share a piece of our life with him or her, that's ideal. Documents are not enough. We need to live them. We need to live with them. If not, if this is the case with Joanna, I mean, if I'm not wrong, she did live with Leonora Carrington. One cannot only rely on archives, on documents, and what we do we rely on in studying an ancient artist. Second point, how many disciplines can we or do we have to merge, intertwine, marry one another to understand what an artist is talking about? Free from any rigid historical or scientific method, free from obligations of one-way disciplines, they can take free rights into their intuitions, into our collective unconscious, to quote Gustav Jung, of course, to use the fast-forward function to look ahead without needing to stop step by step by scholarly built footnotes. Nothing against footnotes, of course, but I think that, to feel free to follow our this mental discourse is really interesting and necessary in studying contemporary art. Third point, what should we look for in understanding the value of an artist, the cultural value, spiritual value of an artist? Something Marshall McLuhan foresaw long ago in 1964. I know he's not fashionable anymore, but I love him, his way of thinking. Was that an artist can literally fascinate us in sight of the new challenges we will have to face thanks to the fast developing of technologies. Recognizing who is foreseeing our new ways of living, thinking and feeling, was the case of Leonora Carrington. Her refusal to lie in rational thinking and to rely on the visible world has made a point about the danger to forget our inner shimmering world while developing, and has been great in telling us that the lifestyle based on machine and their standard operation can be diminishing the deepness of our inner life. The Western way of approaching reality must reflect upon itself. It looks as if Cecilia wanted to tell us how science and anti-scientific methods, meaning the conquest of our medicine or physics, are going hand to hand with the possibility of the unknown. Let's remember that during the first step of the scientific revolution in the 14th century, more or less, 14th, 15th century, a key point was to underline the omnipotence of God. Why this jump in theology? Because the argument went somehow like this: if God is almighty, how can we completely trust the logic of Aristotle? How can we limit the meaning, the flow, the direction of history to some logic rules? Let's open the door to what is a miracle, what is magic, what is not logical. This is like not limiting God. This is a way through religion, through theology, to reach the importance of irrational imagination. And why shouldn't we recognize that the unknown has been so strong to lead to the field of the hypothesis, touching, if necessary, also the fields of the most daring imagination in our philosophical and existential attitude. In other words, we need to break free from any auctoritas. Only by enlarging the landscape of the thinkable can we invent something new and grasp new revelations, a new sight on our souls, a new sight on our bodies, a new sight on our relation toward nature are needed. Nowadays, the main question is, what can we do for our survival in a sick planet? New behaviors of animals and plants during the pandemic have demonstrated how fast can go the process of reconquering space for non-human species. I don't need to quote Donna Haraway, Stefano Mancuso, and many others to say that either we start living in an holistic mindset, following an holistic mindset, or humankind will not stay long on this planet. We might have to die or go away into another unfriendly planet, as Vladislav Lem imagined in his masterpiece, Solaris. At the end of this all, as a part of a changing human condition, we must acknowledge the importance of believing in new types of families. Yes, we should go on believing in having children, no matter under what biological condition they are conceived, adopted, genetically predetermined, born within a non-traditional family, who cares? The love of Leonora Carrington for animals, for monsters, for diverse entities, not only embodies an anthropological respect for long-lasting, hard-to-die symbols, she also tells us that our idea of what life can be must stay open, as wide as possible. The Western culture would be self-destructive not to recognizing certain values. First of all, the rights of the individual to be whoever he wants and to survive despite the pressure of a community. Community is a nice word, but as a matter of fact, it has often meant not to preserve the right of those who are different. And democracy do care for them, at least it should. Yet we cannot defend these values unless we recognize the power of the irrational, the diverse, the unpredictable, this need for melting a Western rationalist Cartesian and to a certain extent male-oriented culture, and a different approach coming from Africa or from Far East or from Celtic or Greek mythologies is important, with or without a psychoanalytical approach, with or without an anthropological and psychological historical approach. So the two scholars who are with us today will maybe help us in dealing with this complex system of problems. And I hope that, having here a storyteller and an historian, melting methods, and having here somebody who has studied an artist by living with her, will help us definitely. And thank you for being here once again.
Good morning, and thank you, Angela, for this very perceptive and challenging introduction. And thank you, Cecilia Alemania, above all, and to her whole team for both inviting me to take part in the show through the catalogue and bringing me to Venice, which is such a delight. The narrator steals a melon, and the greengrocer catches her by the arm and tells her he will hand her over to the police if she doesn't listen to his story. He drags her into the depth of his shop amongst the fruit and vegetables. We went through a door and reached a room where there was a bed in which lay a woman, motionless and probably dead. It seemed to me that she must have been there a long time, for the bed was overgrown with grass. "I water her every day," the greengrocer said thoughtfully, For 40 years, I've been quite unable to tell whether she is alive or dead, but she remains warm. He then lifts the cover, and the narrator continues, I saw a large number of eggs and some newly hatched chicks. That's where I hatch my eggs, the greengrocer tells her. Later, he muses that he'll plant some tomatoes, which will do very well in there. This short story is called L'amoureux, the man in love, and was written in French before the war, when Leonora Carrington was living in the south of France. It was published in Paris in 1938 in a slim pamphlet called La Maison de la Peur, the House of Fear, with collages by Max Ernst. The tale is witchy, comic, shuddery, mocking yet earnest. Ottavio Paz described Carrington as practicing ironic sorcery. Her voice sounds powerfully in this laconic tale, in all its singular imaginativeness. The body of a woman suspended in a state of perpetual transformation between plant and human, life and death, capable of nurturing more life, inspires wonder at the mystery of vitality itself, and also a shudder at necrophilia. The encounter also conveys Carrington's characteristically mordant view of men in love. The greengrocer is sentimental and ruthless, and, we learn later, gifted with the power to dehydrate meat by just looking at it. It is not a coincidence that around this same time, when Leonora painted Max Ernst's portrait, she depicted him in a frozen landscape, one icicled horse in the background and another tiny horse, her own animal familiar, frozen in a lantern globe hanging from his hand. Yet she was strongly attracted to ice and the scenery of the north. As a child, she'd longed to meet Jack Frost, and in The Hearing Trumpet, the heroine, the 92-year-old Marianne Leatherby, a prophetic vision of Leonora herself, is on a journey to Lapland, a Lapland of the mind, an enchanted place. As the greengrocer continues the tale of his marriage, he remembers how on their wedding night, they broke into a house and found themselves in a kitchen. Some vegetables were cooking themselves, jumping around in boiling water. This game delighted them. Metamorphoses, from raw to cooked, from natural bounties such as milk and eggs, fired Leonora's imagination. Like her beloved friend Remedios Varo, also represented in the exhibition, she pursued magical transformations in the kitchen, the home. As mundane a vegetable as a cabbage takes on the aura of a mystic rose. The pot on the stove becomes a magic cauldron. The cooks are brewing potions when they are making soup. Her marvelous, unique comic fantasy, The Hearing Trumpet, climaxes with the pot becoming a cauldron of rebirth. I don't want to suggest Leonora's art illustrates her writing, nor that her stories provide a key to the enigmas of her paintings, but both do reveal her inner preoccupations and the intensity of her awareness of her unconscious, where her dominant motifs combine and recombine in the manner of dreams. I first met Leonora in New York in the late 80s. I had been asked by Paul de Angelis, her publisher, to write a foreword to the short stories he was collecting for the first time in English. It is a mark of Leonora's unworldliness that her writings were scattered and have had a very checkered career, some never printed at all. I had known her work since my student days, by chance, through a friend whose father had been British consul in Mexico, and he had several works by Leonora on the walls of the family's house, where we used to go for weekends. Later, in 1985, Whitney Chadwick's path-breaking book, Women and the Surrealist Movement, which has just been reprinted marvelously by Thames Hudson, opened my eyes to the richness of the history and Leonora's place within it. After writing the foreword to The House of Fear, a second collection of stories, The Seventh Horse, came out with unpublished material. Again, I wrote an introduction. I began visiting Leonora in her one-room basement apartment in Gramercy Park. She liked to live in a burrow, she said. She was scared of heights and would never fly. And when she went back to home to Mexico, she'd take the bus. In this one room, she painted, moving her materials from the table to serve a meal. She was a fine cook, as you can imagine. Her preferred medium, tempera, is a form of cooking, involving the eggs that meant so much more to her than mere eggs. They contain the promise of metamorphosis, the memory of origin, the power of natural energy. Our plan back in 1988 was to make a feature film with the director Gina Nissen, in which Leonora would appear as herself. She agreed to this, and in the script, she would meet the actress who was cast as the young Leonora, who would eventually decide the biopic was trash and refuse the role and set out on a new path. Leonora would have awakened her. And actually, that's what Angela was talking about, that we need a new path. And the idea was that Leonora is a sort of trigger catalyst to this new consciousness. But the screenplay I wrote was turned down, and the project withered. I was enthralled by Leonora and grew to love her very much. She was hugely important to me for complicated reasons, in which admiration, yearning, and identification all played a part. We used to go for long walks through Manhattan, once all the way through to Central Park, to the Met, where she wanted to look at the mummies. She lingered over items that were firmly swaddled and bundled up. Such figures recur in her work. Like living in a borough, the bounded body offered her some sense of security. She would emerge from this small, dark dwelling every month with a new painting to deliver to the Brewster Gallery, where she would collect a small monthly stipend. That is how she got by. In her 70s, she was still a girl of slender means. Life around her was a constant source of curiosity and small pleasures. She told me making art was like making strawberry jam, very carefully and well. In some sense, she remained a surrealist. She picks up on the merveilleux in the banal quotidien and beams it back for us to marvel at with her. She was on a quest for meaning, but content that it was ungraspable, except as mystery. She always talked questioningly rather than making declarations. Her writing, close to the absurdism of Alfred Jarry, has an inventiveness, toughness, and wit that the paintings can sometimes lack, tending sometimes to be a bit wispy and whimsical. Above all, Carrington was an animist. All matter was alive, sentient, capable of feelings. She was sensitive to the life of all creatures, with a special affinity to horses. In the anguished autobiographical novella Little Francis, written in 1937, she imagines herself as a young boy who grows a horse's head. Forms flowed into one another. The metamorphoses in her writing and her paintings are in perpetual flux, a fugue of shape-shiftings, melding and interfusing, rather than an end-stopped change, as in the case of Daphne, turned into a laurel tree forever to escape the assault of Apollo. In Carrington, organisms are on a continuum across the broad spectrum of the life force. Her vision was formed by childhood encounters with fairy lore, according to which flowers, stones, trees, and streams are all animate, possessed of supernatural powers. And also she was deeply involved in different mystical belief systems that she continued to experiment with all her life. Her sensitivity to unseen worlds was fostered by these explorations of ancient classical and Eastern religions, in which the boundaries between phenomena are porous and forms flow and mingled, as expressed by Pythagoras, the southern Italian Greek philosopher, who inspired the overarching principle of Ovid's Metamorphoses, omnia mutantur et nihil interit, all things change and nothing dies. Later, in Mexico, Leonora steeped herself in local myths and accompanying psychical disciplines that also perceived consciousness distributed across phenomena. She responded with immediate sympathy to the magic of Mexican beliefs, especially a belief in the Nahual, or animal familiar, who accompanies each of us. The Catholic faith of her childhood was enhanced by the Latin American marvelous, its magic realism, which inspired her and her fellow artists and friends, Frida Kahlo and Remedios Varo. When I knew her, she was also involved with Tibetan Buddhism and regularly visiting the monastery in upstate New York for retreats. She went through a Jungian analysis and continued to practice altered states in order to create. Above all, she cultivated the hypnagogic threshold between sleep and waking, that passage when images come up vividly in the mind's eye. Her paintings came to her during the interval between sleep and wakefulness, she said. The milk of dreams, the theme Cecilia chose for this Biennale, is an image of alchemical transformations and the liminal state of dreams as nourishment, maternal, nature's bounty. The life principle pulsing through all of creation takes different forms, but endures through time eternally. In numerous works, Carrington conjures monsters and marvels that mix and merge species and fantasies, fur, pelts, beards, wings, talons, beards, horns, and even mechanical parts, and she endows them with seductive internal consciousness. Our human forms are malleable, shifting, even though the medium does not allow movement. They seem to be in the process of metamorphosis in exchange with others. In my essay for the catalogue, which I wrote at the height of the pandemic and called Viral Spiral, I chose to focus on myths of shapeshifters whose form does not settle, as I see Leonora herself as sharing a profound affinity with them. The young woman Mestra is given the power of changing her shape by the gods to save her from her father, who intends to sell her to clients to feed his own insatiable hunger. With her fluid powers, she is able to turn into a young man, a heifer, a mare, a bird. This is another monster from the actual little children's book, The Milk of Dreams. Carrington's sense of the inherently labile nature of matter is not simply celebratory, but questioning, and often profoundly melancholy. Her wit is mother wit, aware of the ambiguity of experience and deeply wise. She feels for animals in their flesh, for all edible things that keep our human energy going. She is filled with wonder shot through with ambiguity and fear. The need for humans to eat, to survive, condemns us to become part of the food chain, and Carrington often alludes to the intrinsic cannibalism of our species. If you believe in the consciousness of all things and identify with fruit and vegetables, milk and eggs, you are necessarily part of this cycle of annihilation, generation, and regeneration. It is striking that Mestra's thuggish and tyrannical father, Erysichthon, who resembles many such patriarchs in Leonora's work, is condemned for cutting down a sacred forest and is cursed to feel perpetual hunger until finally he eats himself. Erysichthon is a potent symbol of the ills that Leonora struggled against throughout her life, consumerism at its lethal extreme. By contrast, the figure of the wife whose flesh grows grass and tomatoes, whose warmth hatches chicks, embodies a marvelous exception to this cannibal sentence on humanity. Animals as food for humans dominates the troubling subject at the center of her imagination. When she described the scene of the temptation of St. Anthony in her painting, she listed what the hermit dreamed of eating in his fevered vision, and then describes how his daily meal consists of withered grass and tepid water, with an occasional locust by way of an orgy. Milk is exempt from the rule of mutual devouring and absorption. So are eggs. They both recur in her work as somewhat innocent states of nature as nurture, capable of bringing forth life. Not only are milk and eggs the prime raw stuff that does not require treatment to become nourishing and life-giving, and is capable of a myriad transformations in cooking, but unlike blood, sweat, and tears, both are anomalous in a binary structure of raw as distinct from cooked, as milk is exuded from the body and eggs are laid in a state that is warm and nourishing and life-sustaining. In Leonora's art, lactating creatures recur, not Madonnas with the bambino from religious imagery, but a hyena with her dugs leaking appears in the self-portrait, now in the Met in New York, with a mist of ectoplasm, itself milky spirit stuff, around her. The same animal makes a spectacular appearance as the narrator's friend in the most remarkable of Leonora's short stories, The Debutante. Mares, badgers, boars with shoats or babies, butterflies, birds of every variety, owls, magpies and partridges, and many, many cats return in the work, often female animals, though not always. But when they are female, their creatureliness is stressed. Think of Virginia Fur, for example, in the story As They Rode Along the Edge. She is one of Leonora's most resplendent feral creatures. She rides on a wheel, accompanied by 100 furious cats. Virginia Fur makes them fierce love in the wilds with Ignomia, a wild boar. In The Milk of Dreams, Ophelia makes a jelly for a party, and when the milkman arrives, she chats with him. She liked the milkman. And a vulture comes in and falls into the bowl of jelly and is set inside it. But the father eats it all up just the same. Her realm of enchantment is domestic, even prosaic, and her art transfigures it. Leonora's concern with the politics of equality, with ecology and disarmament, form a coherent whole with this attachment to the milk of dreams, the site where nourishment and imagination meet and merge. I had expected to find her charming and fascinating, but I had not anticipated to be so utterly enthralled, captivated by her deep voice with its old-fashioned English accent, her beauty still vivid in old age, her spirit so open. She was no longer the wild girl of fantastic tricks and states she had been in the 30s and 40s, but her singularity was still undiminished, her spirit deeply interested in the mystery of life, droll, sharp, mischievous. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to start as well by saying thank you. Thank you so much to Cecilia for inviting me here, and to Manuela and the team, and to Angela, and then especially thank you to Marina for that really interesting, and I found it very moving as well, presentation. I've learnt so much from Marina in my own studies into Leonora, so thank you. In this presentation, I'd like to talk a bit about how I came to know Leonora, what she was like as a person, which is, I knew her at the end of her life, and then I'd like to talk a bit about the research that I've been doing since her death in 2011, which has taken me to many of the places where she lived and worked, and which influenced her work and her story. And then finally, I'd like to say a bit about why I believe that Leonora is an artist for now, for the 21st century. She only saw the first few years of it, but what she was saying and painting and sharing almost 100 years ago now is more cutting edge and relevant and timely, I believe, than ever. So let me start at what for me was the beginning. I was in my early 40s, a journalist, living in London with my husband and our children. I'd grown up in Lancashire. I'm the daughter of a textile mill owner, and I was aware in my teens that there had been some sort of scandal in my family, and that someone, a cousin of my father's, who we all called Prim, had disappeared. She had gone many years before I was born, and she was hardly ever mentioned. It sounded fascinating and thrilling, but no one would tell me anymore. Fast forward to 2006, and I was at a party chatting to a woman who told me she was a Mexican art historian. I knew very little about either Mexico or art history, but for some reason, in that moment, something slotted into place in my mind, and I remembered that Prim's mysterious story had connected with both art and Mexico. That was really all I knew about her. This art historian, I thought, probably wouldn't know anything about her, but I thought it was worth a whirl. So I asked, did she know of an artist called Leonora Carrington in her country? This woman was astonished. Didn't I know how famous Leonora was? Didn't I know anything about her extraordinary story and her even more extraordinary art? Amazingly, I didn't at that point. But that woman's response was the beginning of a fascination in me for Leonora, and that fascination only grew when I went home that evening and read up on her story and looked at her art. Something spoke to me right from the start about meeting Leonora. I knew this was something I had to do. She hadn't had anything to do with our family for many years, and some of my relatives, my father especially, weren't that keen on me going to seek her out. But I was determined to do that. And a few months later, I flew to Mexico City with her phone number in my pocket. We hadn't actually ever spoken until I arrived, but I managed to get her phone number. And on the first morning I was there, I called her, and she said, "Why don't you come straight over?" And I then spent the whole week with her in her house. And by the time I left, I knew I had to come back. It hadn't been enough time with Leonora, and I thought if she would have me back, I wanted to spend as much time as I could with her. So I then went back twice a year until her death in 2011. So now I'd like to tell you a bit about the Leonora I knew, what she was like, why she was so captivating, and what mattered to her. She was 89 when I met her in 2006, but she wasn't someone anyone would call an old woman. And I don't say that because there is anything wrong with being an old woman, but simply because she was a timeless person. She didn't fit into the narrative of getting older any more than she'd fitted into any other narrative in her life. I'll go back to the first one. And that had been the story of why she'd disappeared. She'd gone because of her need to be an artist and because she couldn't live that destiny in the narrow confines and expectations of her bourgeois and economically advantaged family in Lancashire. She didn't fit into our family, and in fact she never would fit in anywhere. Although the closest she came to fitting in was in Mexico City, where she made her life from her mid-20s. But even then, she left Mexico City for some years and went to the States, which is where Marina knew her. So Leonora, when I met her, was living as she always had lived, beyond the boundaries. She wasn't limited in the ways that most people are limited, which is by the expectations and conventions of other people. She was always curious, and one of the reasons our relationship worked was because she didn't just want to tell me or anyone else about her life. She wanted to hear about what was going on in other people's lives, and what I was able to tell her was what had happened in our family in the 60 years or so since she'd left it behind, 70 years I guess it was. She never pontificated, as Marina said. She asked questions, a lot of questions. And she shared a different take on things because she saw the world in a different way. And not just the world we know we're in, because she saw into other worlds as well. And when you were with Leonora, you felt you were on the verge of many other universes. You felt you were in touch with worlds of the past and the present and the future, worlds of animals and insects, worlds of gods and goddesses and spirits, worlds of the dead and the unknown. She seemed to be able to access those worlds. She didn't claim she could do that, but when you were with her, you felt you were going with her into these other spheres. She was a great enabler, certainly in my own life. She was someone who empowered others. And there was an energy around her that if you tuned into it, flowed into you as well. During Leonora's lifetime, especially in the first few visits, I would talk to her about the book I had one day hoped to write. And she asked me to wait until she was dead to write that book, which suited me fine because I wanted to have an excuse to go on seeing her, going to visit her. But gradually, over time, the book receded, and by the time she died in 2011, I thought I probably wouldn't write a book because it had become a relationship about something else by that point, and I was never really a journalist with Leonora. I was her cousin, and I'm very proud of that relationship. It meant a huge amount to me, and I really hope it meant at least a small amount to her. But then the 100th anniversary of her death was approaching in 2017, and another chance conversation. There have been a lot of chance conversations in my story of how I've come to know Leonora and the work I've done around her story and her art. Another chance conversation led to me deciding to write my book. And at this point, sort of 2016, I embarked on a journey in the footsteps of Leonora that continues to this day. And I'd like to share with you some photos. These are just photos from my phone from places I've visited in Leonora's footsteps. I've traced her life from the Lancashire where she was born and spent her early years in houses. This one is Crookie Hall, which some of you may recognize from a painting of the same name. This is Hazelwood Hall, the house the family moved to, a much less scary house, not closer to the sea, also in Lancashire. I've been to the schools she visited, or been in touch with the schools she was a pupil at in Essex and Berkshire. She was expelled from both of these schools. The London, where I live, but she was presented at the court of King George V and Queen Mary at Buckingham Palace. She came out as a debutante in 1935, and then somehow she managed to persuade her parents to allow her to attend art school. I've been to Paris. This is the apartment block in Saint-Germain where Leonora lived with the man she met in London and followed to Paris, Max Ernst. This is the Café de Flore where they hung out. There's the De Magot Café just across the street, but Leonora and Max were usually in this cafe. So I've spent time there, and it's a very wonderful place to hang out as well to this day, of course. And I have travelled just very recently. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in this amazing place. This is the Ardèche Gorge in a place called Saint-Martin d'Ardèche in the south of France. And I swam in that river, just as Leonora did when she and Max camped on those white stones you can see. And I have also been exceptionally fortunate enough to spend quite a lot of time in the house where Leonora and Max moved to. It was Leonora's house. She bought it with money that she got from her family, from her mother. They moved to this house on the hillside in above Saint-Martin, and this is the outside of the house, and you can see, I think, the bas-relief on the outside of the house created by Max Ernst, which shows a female figure and a figure that's Max's alter ego, Lop Lop, on the side of the building. That's what you can see from the road. It's an extraordinary place. And inside, it's extraordinary too. There are paintings on the cupboards. This is one by Leonora on just a cupboard door. There's a long story about why this house has been untouched, as it has for all these decades. But basically, when you're in this house, you feel like Leonora just left. I can't describe it any better than that. And they clearly painted the house there. They used that, the house was their fabric. So there's sculpture on the walls, there are paintings. This is a piece that I think is probably by Leonora. That's the sitting room. You can just see what an ordinary sitting room it is, because it's been this family's home for all these years, since Leonora left and Max left in 1940. That's a cupboard. And Leonora's books, that isn't actually her bookcase, that's the other side of the room. I took that put that photograph in because it's the paintings by her. But on the other side of the room, there's an entire bookcase with all her books. She had a lot of stuff sent out, actually, to France when she lived there. So that is the house in the south of France. It's an extraordinary treasure trove of surrealist art that has not been possible for art historians to explore for various reasons, quite complicated to get into right now. From the south of France, she crossed to Spain. Max Ernst had been taken away because he was German, and this was France in the war, Vichy France. He was taken away and imprisoned, and Leonora left France. She left the house, she sold the house, it was her house to sell, she sold it, and she travelled to Spain. So this is Santander in the north of Spain, to where she was taken, and she was ended up in a place she always called the asylum. Now, before I went there, I had an idea of what this asylum was like, because she always called it the asylum, and in my mind there was this Victorian, very forbidding place. Actually, it was a sanatorium. I mean, terrible things happened to her there. But the asylum looked slightly different from the way I thought it would look before I went there. So it was actually a series of buildings across a parkland in a rather, at the time it must have been a rather beautiful spot, I think, of Santander. And I should have put this piece of Leonora's work in the presentation, but if people know a piece by her called Map of Down Below, when I went to the park, I realized that some of the places in that map actually existed and still remain in the park to this day. That's a figure, and you see a figure quite like that in her map, and that's the grotto, and the grotto is quite clearly there in her map. I've also spent time just very recently as well, been back to Lisbon for the second or third time to explore her time there. Leonora, there's a big long story and lots of adventures in how she got away from the asylum and then travelled through Madrid and then ended up in Lisbon. And here's Lisbon, the neutral city of the Second World War, through which so many refugees, including Leonora, travelled to embark on a new life across the Atlantic. Getting away from Hitler, and in her case, also getting away from her family. And she used to say that of the two, her family, you can guess, were the worst. I found the house, if I go the right way through, this is the house where Leonora lived with the man she had met on her journey, because Max, remember, she'd left him behind in France, she'd moved on, and she met a Mexican poet and diplomat called Renato Leduc, and this is the house where they lived in Lisbon, which I just discovered when I was there earlier this year, because there are actually two streets with the same name in Lisbon. The first time I went there, I thought she lived in Alfama, which is the area that also has a street with this name, but this time I did a bit more research with a local historian, and this house, which is more in the kind of central downtown and was near the refugee centre, would have been, we discovered, where she actually lived. This is the restaurant where I've had supper, and so did Leonora, and also at the table in this restaurant, the Leo Douro in Lisbon, would have been Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim, because now there was a new twist in her story. The Max Ernst, who she'd left behind in France, and then travelled on without and met her this guy, Renato Leduc, with whom she was going to Mexico. In Lisbon, she bumped into Max Ernst again. He had obviously had a lot of adventures himself, and he had ended up in Lisbon also waiting to go across the Atlantic. And with him was his new partner, Peggy Guggenheim. Obviously, Peggy has an enormously big importance in this city. And there is a wonderful exhibition on there, which includes work by Leonora and other people in her circle right now. So from Lisbon, Leonora travelled first to New York and then on to Mexico City. And Mexico City would be her substantive home for the rest of her life. She would spend time in the States, as I said earlier, later on, from the sort of 70s on and the 80s and the 90s into the 90s. But in the mid-1940s, she moved to live in a house in the Roma area of Mexico City with a new husband, the third important man in her life, who was her substantive husband, a photographer called Cheeky Weiss, with whom she would have two sons, the sons for whom she wrote the stories in The Milk of Dreams. And that house became her kingdom, her sanctuary, and her kingdom. That's the place where I knew her. Let me move on to... It was in some ways, this room, this is the room that I met her on the doorstep, and then this was the first place we went to talk, the kitchen. It was always, and the whole house, in fact, was always cold, which was a very strange thing in a very warm city like Mexico City. Leonora was always completely perplexed by it. Why is it so cold? We could never work it out. And the kitchen was a very important space in our house because it was always the place of discussion and the place where she entertained, where people came to talk, where ideas were discussed, and cooking, as Marina said, was always very important in her life. It represented something as well. And in this kitchen, she would have spent a lot of time with her good friends in Mexico City, the Spanish painter Remedios Varo, whose work is also included in The Witch's Cradle here at the Biennale, and the Hungarian photographer Kati Horner, whose work I would encourage you to seek out because I believe she's a talent who should be much better known. This is her kitchen. Now, since Leonora died in 2011, I returned to Mexico several times, but I only went back to the house last year. It had been mothballed for a while, but then through 2020, now in the ownership of the Autonomous University of Mexico, it's been recreated in the same way that Frida Kahlo's house, the Blue House, was recreated after her death. That, as you maybe know, is in Coyoacán, another neighborhood of Mexico City. So as you can imagine, it was very odd for me being back there because it was exactly as I remembered it, except without Leonora. And everything, that kitchen is exactly the kitchen that she walked into, the kitchen she knew. The whole house is exactly as it was at the end of her life. The house will, the hope is that this house will open to the public later on this year or maybe next year. I would say that the most moving room in the house, the most poignant room in the house is this room, which is Leonora's bedroom. If the whole house was her sanctuary, then this was really her inner sanctuary. Not many people went into that room. And she always liked somewhere that she could get away and be on her own. Her bedroom shows, I think, a lot about her, her kind of natural, she was very naturally frugal. She wasn't somebody for whom how things looked, or, you know, she lived simply, as Marina said, in the flat, the apartment in New York City. It was the same in Mexico. This is the sitting room, the room where she would have entertained friends like Octavio Paz, who was part of her inner circle, as well as the emigre artists I mentioned, like Remedios Varo and Kati Horner, and also the surrealist patron Edward James, who was another frequent visitor to that house. Then there's that's just a corner of her bedroom with the tarot cards, which she was very interested in, and indeed did a wonderful set of tarot cards, which has now been exhibited in Mexico City. This is her studio. Edward James once said that it was full of dogs and cats and stuff all over the place, and there were just a few paintbrushes that hardly had any hairs in them. You know, it just looked like the last place on earth where art could be produced. And he said, "My spirit soared." I knew that this was a place where art could be produced. Having said that, Leonora painted all over the house. She didn't only paint in the studio. This is the top floor of the house, which has been made into a study center. And I mention that because the idea is that scholars will be able to go there and study Leonora's work in the house going forward. For example, there's her whole book collection there. I mentioned the book collection also in the house in France, but there's a huge book collection there, and I'm sure there's some scholar somewhere just waiting to go through that. That's one of Leonora's sculptures on the top floor, rather nicely displayed. So then I just want to say very quickly, I've spoken for too long, but I just want to say very quickly about why, for me, Leonora is such an artist for our age. Since her death, I've spent a lot of time looking at her paintings and thinking about them. When she was alive, I didn't really need to do that because I had her, but now she's gone, I feel there's so much more to find out about her and through her, and that's all connected with her art, obviously. And I'm struck time and again by how she was such a visionary, and by how the issues she was interested in exploring in her life and her work are the issues that the world has come so many decades after she was interested in them to realize are the essential issues of our time. And I'm thinking about things like the interconnectivity of everything. We seem to be kind of emerging from a time when different parts of life were kept in silos. We didn't connect, for example, the way people maybe lived in their own life with what they believed publicly, or with the feeling that it was okay to behave in one way in some settings and another way in other settings. And we lived in a time when people didn't always connect what they were doing in their homes, throwing away food, for example, a lot of food, with what was happening in the wider world, or using chemical products without thinking of their impact on the environment. Leonora was always about that kind of connectivity. She always understood that what happens in one arena of life affects what happens in lots of other arenas. And what we do in our own lives affects the wider world. She brought us back to basics, the basics on which everything is founded. She was very honest about what she didn't know. I think Marina mentioned this as well. And she would often say, all I know is that I'm a female human animal and that I will one day die. All I know. And this is a woman by this time in her 90s who'd spent her whole life questing for what it was all about. But she was so honest about how much of the universe was unknown to her. But she did believe this, that what we do in one universe affects all other universes. Leonora was very close to nature. She felt very connected with nature. Marina has also talked about that, about her connection with animals, her animal familiar, the horses. She identified primarily not as a human, but as an animal, a human animal. She didn't think humans were the best animals or the highest animals or even necessarily, or even the most intelligent animals. And she thought understanding that was important for the future. And I think many more people believe that now as well. She was very congruent, and she absolutely lived by the values she believed in. She connected with nature, and she writes about this in Down Below, the story of her time in Santander. She describes in there how she was she had a breakdown at this point. She's on her way to Santander at this point, actually. She's in Spain on her way to Madrid, from where she'll be going to Santander. She's in the beginning of this, or she's in the throes, really, of huge emotional and mental turmoil. And she naturally goes to the land. She goes and lies down in the land. She says, one day I went to the mountain alone. At first I couldn't climb. I lay flat on my face on the slope with the sensation that I was being completely absorbed by the earth. When I took the first steps up the slope, I had the physical sensation of walking with tremendous effort in some matter as thick as mud. Gradually, it became easier. And then she goes on to describe how she kind of makes a pact with the mountain and the birds and the goats. And why I mention this is just a couple of weeks ago in my day job, my real job, as a journalist, I was writing a piece about a rewilding sanctuary, and I went on what's now called forest bathing, and that's exactly what you do when you go forest bathing. And forest bathing is a completely, 2022. I know it started in Japan a few years ago, but it's a relatively recent idea, and Leonora was already doing it all these years before. So she was ecologically so far ahead. She was a feminist. She was an eco-feminist. She was also a searcher who looked not inside conventional religions for a better understanding of herself and the world, but looked across the whole field of spirituality, of different traditions and different belief systems. She was the antithesis of what we sometimes see in the world of social media today. She wasn't about appearance at all, and she wasn't about questions that couldn't be asked. I think in her art, but equally in the way she lived, she was a model for how human beings might better be in this world. And I believe she has a lot still to say. I feel I was so lucky to hear from her firsthand about some of her ideas, but she has left us with a huge body of work, maybe as many as 2,000 pieces of work to look through and discover in the years ahead. And also, I don't think she's very far away, because I believe in those interwoven worlds, the world she painted and inhabited, and I know that she's in one of those worlds right now. And finally, I can't speak for Leonora, and I have to tell you the truth that she would have been the first person to tell me not to try and do that. But we often talked about women artists in the world and the difficulties for women artists. And I do think that I'm okay to say that she would have been really proud that her work has led to a biennale that is being called the Women's Biennale. I know that she'd have been pleased about that. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of you. And of course, the public is asked to ask questions, but I will break the ice. And I was wondering, maybe you already answered, but why did she become such a loner? Loner.
Loner, why was she such a loner?
Yeah.
Is this working? Why do you think, what do you think made her a loner?
I don't know. I think that she had diminished the quantity of relationships that she allowed in her life. So she wanted maybe one-to-one relationships, very deep ones, and also the decision to stay in Mexico and not to travel abroad was like a way to isolate herself. Was that because of the search for a better concentration, or maybe like the falling apart of the first part of her life, which was about traveling and being a nomad and with the heart and with the feet also. Yeah. So what's your idea? Why did she isolate them?
I don't think she did. I think that's a misunderstanding. She did not like the society into which she was born, and she explicitly chose different company. She wanted, and in Mexico she was extremely social. And she was the center of part of, not exactly the center, but after the Mexican government brilliantly offered an amnesty to anyone who had been displaced, and also Jews, of course, who could get away, displaced by the Second World War, they attracted marvelous. I mean, Joanna mentioned several of them, but it was much larger than that. I mean, Benjamin Perret, who was married to Remedios, for example, created some extraordinary work inspired by Mexico. And then she had a wide circle. I mean, we know the famous names, but she made friends easily. She was and when she was bringing up Pablo and Gabby, she had a familial world in Mexico City. She left Mexico because of the politics. She left Mexico the first time, took the bus to New York, because there was a demonstration in which several students were killed. And she was so angry with the government for this assault, so it was a political move to get out of a tyrannical. She really had a deep, profound aversion to tyranny. So, and then she went back. But one of the things that happened is that her marriage to Chiqui became, I think, to her rather boring. She was torn between. I mean, I remember this wonderful, delinquent, mischievous woman, saying, "I must go back and look after Chiqui," because she actually still had some of her old-fashioned and very Catholic sense, and that's exactly what she did. She left New York because Chiqui was, not well. He lingered for a long time, but she nursed him devotedly. And I think, and in New York, she lived as a loner because she didn't have any love at all for the glamorous world of the arts. So though she would like to have been recognized, I mean, she would, as you said, Joanna, be very proud of being identified with women artists. She really would not have liked the glitz that is going on. I mean, she was extremely unworldly, very, very uninterested in money, very uninterested in fame. I mean, her sort of lack of concern for her own work, apart from this tiny stipend she was getting for her singing, it's just extraordinary in an artist. Most artists and writers are vain and conceited and want to look after every word they ever write. She was not like that, but I think she was extremely warm and and had such a sort of smiling, bright person that to think of her as a loner, she wasn't eccentric in that way at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with with what you just said, and she would actually. I always felt kind of almost take it further than you're saying, and kind of almost shoot herself in the foot. You know, where somebody could be useful, yes. She would usually fall out with them. That people in Mexico City who were very important would have been very, very important for her.
She didn't like pomp. And the other thing we should mention about her, because we mustn't forget this, is that she had a lot of lovers. You know, she had many love affairs. And one of the things, I mean, it's sort of marvelous about her that when she got older, she decided this was not sort of no longer very, very, you know, I think she said something sort of very funny to me, like, I think when I lost my last tooth, I gave up sex.
I was always asking her, like, when did her life, like, move on from that point? And she would say to me, oh, it's so long ago now, I can't remember, you know, and I was always very keen.
Yes, but she did. I mean, we don't know, of course, we don't know people's private lives, but I think there were quite a number. I mean, I do know that, but I just don't know how far it went. I mean, she inspired, you know, her beauty was astonishing. You can see it in the photographs. And she inspired, and the sort of vivacity of her personality was also entrancing. And she was very, I mean, she came from a different generation that was much less puritanical about sex.
And from a kind of advantaged background where people were freer
Yes, I think that part of this, what she didn't like was the hypocrisy of the society. She liked it to be open. I mean, she was a bohemian at heart.
Mm.
So let's put it this way. Why didn't she care about fame? Why didn't she like the art world?
Yes, well.
I mean, I think it was because she was interested in creating. For her, it wasn't about how anybody else would see the work she created. It was. I always felt that it was getting out of herself, the stuff she just had to get out, and that's why, you know, she said to me, she described her need to create art as like how I'd understand it, my need for food. Like you go to the kitchen to find the food to eat. She had to go to the studio to paint, and I think it was the same with her writing. So it actually for her was not about how other people were going to see it. Although, of course, you know, she was a human being, and she always was. She was very pleased. I used to, in the time I was with her, if, for example, at the beginning, the Tate had very little of her work. They still haven't got very much, but they've got a little bit now. And when I used to go and tell her that this had happened or that had happened, she was obviously not unhappy. She was pleased that people were recognizing she was a human being.
Yes, in fact, it's one of my sources of great sort of anger and bitterness against the art world is that she had so little recognition in her lifetime. There was a good exhibition at the Serpentine in London, and really good, and they borrowed a lot of private works. And the Tate was offered one of them, and they turned it down. It was £5,000. £5,000. They're now millions. You know, so and they wouldn't do it.
They're worth.
That's the sort of hegemony of taste that you know didn't look at the spirit or the future, and indeed what you said about the politics. They didn't look at that. You know, they just saw a woman artist who was sort of painting from her unconscious. But I actually, just to make a point, that because you touched on it very well, about her not being interested in, you know, how people reacted, being needing to engage. I do think a mark of sort of great artistry is this capacity to lose yourself in the dream. It doesn't have to be the unconscious, like in surrealism. It can be, you can be painting a landscape, but at the same time, the depth of your engagement where the self dissolves is really something that I think marks the artistic, creative imagination. And she definitely had that. And she really was, in her very witty way, because she was always witty. And this ironic sorcery is very good, because you never could tell, you know, when she was buying a potion or, you know, saying she was going to cast a spell. You could never tell whether she really meant it, you know, because she wasn't like a mystic. She wasn't like a kind of Tibetan monk herself, although I don't know many Tibetan monks. Maybe they're very witty too. But she was always undercutting her own mysticism. But she was a sort of mystic, she was.
Yeah, but another question. is how deeply was she a believer? Did she believe in what did she believe? Like an holistic, pantheistic sort of spirit, or maybe, because you describe her as very witty, and so both mystic and witty.
Yes. No, I know, but
Strange mix.
There seems to be a contradiction, but there wasn't in her case. I mean, I suppose that is quite actually, Taoist. It's about the sort of the kind of absurdity of the universe being also wise. But she really did believe in animals' spirits. I mean, that was absolutely the case. I mean, I remember two things she said. One, dogs are so generous, they give us all their intelligence. They hand over to us all their intelligence. And then she also said once about horses, she said, unlike us, horses have their mind, their memory, their intelligence in their whole skin. You touch a horse, she was a very good rider, of course, when she was young. You touch a horse, somewhere, and its whole body is a consciousness. So, sorry.
And she also said, do you remember that a mask, she said that a dog once barked at a mask she'd made, and that was the highest compliment that she could get for her art. But I was just, one thing I wanted to say in relation to what you were just talking about, in defense, I guess, of the art world, in terms of, which I wouldn't normally be saying it from that point of view, but just to be fair, Leonora did make her own legacy difficult in the art world, because most of her paintings refer very strongly back to her origins in Lancashire and Ireland, her Celtic background, but then she takes herself off to a place very far away, Mexico, and she doesn't really paint. Of course, there are some paintings, and the magical world of the Mayans, which you showed, is probably the finest of those, and there are others. But an awful lot of her work unpacks this other world. And then her paintings are sold in New York, and I think it's been difficult for the art world to know, well, are they Latin American? I mean, usually they are Latin American, but then the themes are British, or European. And I think that's been complicated. And I often compare her to Frida Kahlo, who lived down the road and who was her friend in her early time in Mexico City. And when you look at Frida's life, everything she did added up to her being easier to categorize. She spent her whole life in the same place. She had the father who was the photographer. Her life is very well catalogued. She paints her reality in the one place. So she's much easier for the art world to take on board than Leonora, who typically of Leonora, everything's complicated and confused and across boundaries.
She didn't talk the talk at all. She didn't really explain her work. I think because there really isn't an explanation. I mean, I think that in the sense they are close to dreams, the paintings. The writings were just completely neglected, except in France. In France, she's published. Some of them were written in French, but not all. Some of it's translated. Yves Bonnefoy, a great poet, translated some of her work into French. But here in the Anglophone world, she was the writing was very neglected. So, and it was hard, even after the two collections of short stories came out. With all the efforts I could make to influence people, I could not get them back into print.
Nevertheless, she was not bitter.
No.
Nevertheless, she was not bitter.
No, she was disappointed because she knew at the very end of her life, she knew that some of us in England were trying to get her stories published again. And she was disappointed that they didn't happen. She would like to have seen them in print again.
Another way I think that sometimes people misinterpret her is that they think, you sometimes read people giving the impression that she was kind of being awkward in not describing her work or not wanting to talk about her work. But as Marina says, I think it was, well, what she said to me one day is, I'm not trying to be awkward, I just can't describe it because that's why it's a painting and not, because it's not a verbal thing, it's not a written thing, it's a painting, it's just what I feel. And it's there, and I think the other reason why she didn't want to discuss her work is it would be boring for her. She wanted to talk about what else was going on. She could have sat in that kitchen, certainly in the years I knew her, and just talked about the old days in Paris, and she just didn't want to do that. She wanted to talk about American politics or what was happening down the road or just what was happening on the street corner. Because the other thing about the friendships was she had a lot of very local friends. I'm sure she was the same in New York. And she didn't have sort of hierarchies of friendship. So somebody who was, you know, the guy who sold her the English language newspaper at the end of the street was as much a friend, was likely to be a much better friend than the very important art gallery dealer who'd be coming into town.
Some of her unpublished writings are quite explanatory, actually, which is why they haven't been published, because they're not the fanciful stories that we, and the witty fanciful stories that we know. But and one of them is a kind of warning against nuclear proliferation.
Warning?
Against nuclear proliferation. It's a sort of ecological manifesto about nature and about not violating the planet. And it's not dated, but so it's difficult to know. I thought that it could have been written around the time of the Cuban crisis, but it reads completely timely. I mean, it's a very, very powerful piece of apocalyptic anxiety writing. And also a call for stewardship, a call, very, you know, something, as you said, she was an ecologist, and you said eco-feminist. I mean, but very, you know, very alert to that issue. That's a piece.
What did she read?
Yes, that's fascinating about the cupboard in Saint-Martin.
Yeah, the cupboard in Saint-Martin is extraordinary. In fact, the first time I went to the house, I found, this is astonishing, but I opened a drawer. I mean, the guy who owned the house was there, and there was a letter from Max Ernst in the drawer, and letters from my great-aunt, Maury, to Leonora. I mean, this house is extraordinary. In the way it's just
I thought she'd sold it for £1.
yeah, she did sell it for no money, because you see she had debts in the town and she had to get out quick, so she would never have left with debts.
Because Max Ernst went back to reoccupy it and found it had been passed on.
Yes, it must have been a terrible moment for him, and I think it was a terrible moment, but he did get some of the art out.
Yes. What about the books, though? Did you take notes? Because I'd love to know what
there's an inventory now of those books.
I'd love to see that.
And a lot more work could be done on those, but they're mostly in the house in France. They're mostly Leonora's books, although there are a few German books that must have been Max's that he brought. But for example, there are the catalogues of the Surrealist exhibitions in both Paris and London, both of which Leonora and Max would have gone to. And there are also a lot of those childhood books and ghost stories from the past, you know, from her life in Lancashire, and they're annotated, you know, Happy Birthday, Prim from Ma and Pa and Pat and her brothers in Lancashire. So they're mostly childhood stories.
Because her writing, especially the early short stories, very much comes out of you know, you quite rightly said that there's a sort of contradiction between being witty or comic and a mystic. But actually there's quite a strong British tradition of that in the sort of fairy tales. But they often begin rather ironic. I mean, they're often quite ironical. If you think of something like Lewis Carroll, it's not solemn at all. You know, so that's quite a strong strain in our national imagination, and it's of course Irish, and it's inflected by the Irish. And she knew quite a lot of that material. But even someone like Rudyard Kipling, who one wouldn't think of, you know, when he tackles fairylands, he does it in a very powerful, convincing way. That he makes them very real in Puck of Pook's Hill, and he very much regrets that Britain has lost this fairy world that we've now turned into rationalists. But at the same time, it's a comic book. I mean, not a comic book, it's a humorous book.
Did she read poetry?
I mean, there was poetry there from her childhood, in the childhood books. In her library, the other library, of course, is in Mexico City, a much more substantial library there, because that's, you know, the books of 60 years of life in that house. I can't remember poetry there, but the thing that really struck me when I first went to the house was how contemporary her taste was. You know, this was not somebody, even in her late 80s and 90s, who was reading novels of long ago. You know, she was into Ian McEwan, Margaret Atwood, Doris Lessing. These were the authors she was, and not just the ones they'd published a few years before. I remember once going into that house and there was the latest Ian McEwan. I just arrived from London, and you know, she was absolutely up to the minute in her reading.
Interesting, yes. One writer who has been invoked by Cecilia in her catalogue, who I think has an affinity with her, is Ursula Le Guin. I don't know if she read her, but Cecilia has used the carrier book, the carrier bag essay, as a leitmotif of the show. The idea that we must think of a different way of organizing material, and the women going out gleaning and filling their carrier bags with seeds and so forth, is a sort of model of how we should approach knowledge rather than rigid, more linear kind of categories. And you mentioned about imagining another world, another planet, and of course she does that in I think it's not The Left Hand of Darkness, but can't remember what the novel is called, but in which the socialists are all forced to move to another planet because of the failure of that, and then it's very much a dream example of a kind of neoliberal society flourishing, and she critiques that in the novel.
So science fiction also was part of her
Yes.
baggage, let's say. Yeah. I don't know whether somebody from the public wants to intervene, to ask for something. Yes, of course. Maybe, you should have a mic.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with great expert of Leonora Carrington work. So my question is, first of all, is something like a splinter question to Cecilia too, is on the top of the square, the red square, there's no literature. And this chat to me is a lot about literature. So what I want to ask you, Marina and Joanna, is about, I'm really interested in a study of Leonora Carrington from a literary perspective. And the first example, first of all, thinking about the relationship and the dialogue between I don't know, the mysterious bookcase in Leonora House. I really want to know what kind of book she was reading, and the reason why she came to Mexico, that is to me the cradle of fantastic stories, is maybe something like Juan Rulfo, Carlos Fuentes, those kind of artists. And the specific question is about Julio Cortázar. If there's any reference of this work in memories of Leonora, especially something like Final de Juego and some short stories from that book. Thank you very much.
So you're asking about a specific book? Yeah. And that would be in Mexico City, in the house in Mexico City, and I don't know of the full inventory of the books there. There are far fewer books in the house in France, and obviously they came from England, the ones she brought with her. So I don't. In fact, the library in Mexico City is kind of waiting there for a scholar to go and spend time. You know, some doctoral student or somebody who's got the time and the interest to do this. But there's a very interesting piece of research there, because I'm sure that her books there'll be annotations in her books, and that library, which is a really sizable library, I mean hundreds and hundreds of books. There are 150 books in the house in France, but there are hundreds and hundreds of books in the house in Mexico. And somebody and there's this study center, as I say, on the top floor. The whole idea is to bring scholars in, and that will be an interesting piece of work for somebody.
Yes, well, I think your question is very to the point, because there really hasn't been enough exploration of that aspect that you talked about, both the Latin American marvelous, the magical realism connection to her imagination, which I think is one of the reasons that she definitely stayed in Mexico. I mean, there are obviously lots of social and personal reasons. I mean, it was, she wasn't very well off, and it was easier for her to live in Mexico City than it was for her to live in London. I mean, and bring up the children. And I mean, Chiqui was not working for quite a long time of that period. So, she had to make do and get by on her mostly paintings, since she never managed to publish anything that made any money. But what is striking about her literary oeuvre is that it is actually quite large. I mean, she was quite a serious continual writer. We haven't mentioned that she wrote some plays which were put on in Mexico City. And we staged one in just a reading at the guest projects, the Yinka Shonibara studio in London. And it was very amusing. It's called The Invention of Mole, which is the chocolate sauce that some Mexican dishes are cooked in. And in Leonora's story, characteristically, eventually, after many ingredients are chosen and put into the cauldron, another stew pot, in which she brews her magic things, eventually the chocolate sauce comes to perfection when the Archbishop of Canterbury is thrown into the pot and boiled. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, for those of you who are Italian or from other places, is the highest prelate, is the equivalent of the English Pope. So you can imagine that this chocolate is brought to perfection by the Pope being boiled. So this, but there are several other plays, and some of them, certainly not published, but very, very little work has been done on them. And she created masks for them and costumes for them, and her friends played in them too. So this was an aspect of her sociability. Mm. But then there's quite a lot of writing, there's a lot of alchemical writing. There's a whole novel called The Stone Door, which was published in France more successfully, La Porte de Pierre. But I don't know how translated she is into Italian. But anyway, there's an oeuvre, there's a considerable literary oeuvre. I can't answer the question about Julio Cortázar, I'm afraid.
And another play that Marina reminds me of, which I feel is kind of still, it's still for the future, is called The Last Egg. And it's about the last egg on Earth. Really? And how it's protected and what's going to happen to it. It's absolutely about the future of humanity. And I don't think you had the giantess in your presentation.
No, I don't know what happened to it.
Oh, is it?
It was meant to be there, but it vanished.
Because many of Leonora's paintings, the egg, the egg is there, yes. And in the giantess, maybe as in the last egg, the egg is the future, protecting it. And I mean, we're talking about work that's produced in the 1940s, and this is completely where we are now, the last egg, the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
She also dramatized her life story as a play, Penelope. I say Penelope because it was published in French, I think, Penelope, in which the story that you were telling about her escaping from her family background and the story she dramatizes in the Debutante with the horse flying out of the window, that is part of the, and the father destroying the horse, the angry tyrannical father smashing the horse to pieces and the horse screams in pain. That's dramatized in Penelope.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions? The mic is arriving.
Okay. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I have a related question about Carrington's literary work. Obviously, she wrote from the very beginning of her life, but then she seems to have stopped sometime in the 70s. And then, of course, most of her work was published after that point. But my question is, why do you think she stopped writing and only focused on her visual art from the 70s onwards? Or perhaps a second question, is there unpublished material that she wrote after the 70s in some archive somewhere?
Well, it isn't dated, the material, and there's a lot of trouble dating her material. For example, The Hearing Trumpet, which is probably her masterpiece in terms of fiction, which some of you I'm sure have read, which is a fully sustained, extraordinary mythic novel, very comic and very marvelous allegory also, featuring Mary Magdalene and all kinds of Holy Grail and lots and lots of strands. That was, its thought was probably written in the 50s, but it's not known. I mean, it came out, as you said, it came out much later. And then the pile of pieces of paper that I have from her now mostly has been published, because that's what Paul De Angelis used for the editing the Seventh Horse. But there's still a few fragments there that haven't been. They're really fragments, but I'm sure there's a lot more. I mean, some of the stories were found, for example, when Jimmy Ernst died. Jimmy Ernst was the son of Max Ernst's first marriage, and somehow, I think because he knew Leonora in New York in the 40s, when he died, some manuscripts of hers were found in his papers. So there's a very ghostly trail. And I think that actually I would give a very practical answer to the reason that she stopped writing, which is that she really did need to make some money. And she could make money by making paintings. Probably we should say that she didn't inherit from her parents. I mean,
Not she didn't inherit a large amount of money. I mean, there was money left in trust for her in Britain, but I don't know the ins and outs of how she was. That she didn't get it in her lifetime anyway. No. So she didn't have. She was not someone who had lots of money. Ever. And those paintings that, as you rightly say, are now worth millions of pounds. Of course, she sold them to Edward James for $200.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he sustained her for quite a while during those early years. Edward James sustained her during the early years.
Yeah, he did. And his collection, which is now smaller, because it was sold, there was a big sale of his collection. But before, that must have been a great collection of her work, and it's obviously a great shame that it was separated and split up. And another problem with her legacy is how much of her work is still in private collections and all over the world. Many of them in America as well as Mexico and spread out over Europe. So that makes it difficult for people having big shows because they're very expensive.
I mean, you probably noticed that there are no paintings in the house. I mean, there's only sculptures.
Yeah.
So that's also an example of how difficult it is to create a kind of real sense of the corpus.
In the house, when I was spending time with her in the house in Mexico City, there were studies, quite a lot of studies for paintings, and she had 3 paintings left, and she kept them, goodness knows why, in a locked, admittedly, room on the roof. But to get to this room, you had to go up a spiral staircase, which is always quite scary, even for me, let alone for her. And then she'd get them, and I remember once taking me up there and getting them out and putting them on an easel. And then when I started saying, "Oh, this one's interesting. Do you think this is about, your childhood and school and things that I could connect with?" She said, "Oh, let's put them away and go downstairs now." There were just 3 paintings, but of course, yes, there are no paintings in the house now, and it is mostly her sculpture. And her sculpture was what she did at the very end of her life. There's a marvelous piece of sculpture here in the exhibition in the Guggenheim at the moment, but that dates from much earlier in her career, like in the 50s. But at the very end of her life, when it became more difficult for her to paint, she was with help making sculptures, and they're in the house.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this. I have a question. How Catholic was Leonora Carrington in the rest of her life, and did it influence her till the end or not? And if Marina Warner, who was a very specialist on Maria, and you knew her, did you talk about her, about your book of Maria?
Well, did you talk to her about Catholicism? Because you're Catholic, aren't you? So
Yes, and you were raised a Catholic as well.
I was raised, yes,
Yeah.
but I'm lapsed.
Yes, we did talk about Catholicism. I mean, I think, it had obviously imbibed her early life, being raised in that Catholic family, and her paintings, some of her paintings are sort of populated by the nuns of the convent school that I think you went to the same convent school. You maybe recognise some of the nuns.
Yes, I wasn't expelled because I was a good girl. But actually it was a point of great rapport with her. I said to her, I went to St. Mary's, and she said, "Oh no, how amazing." So, but she was expelled for extraordinary reason, which is that she because she was ambidextrous, she could write backwards. And the nuns thought this was diabolical. But you know, she painted with both hands, something I've never seen except her doing. And you think it's completely logical, but painters use a palette on their right hand, so, or whichever they are, so, or their left arm, so they don't usually use both hands. But of course, it's perfectly possible to paint with both hands. And she had her tempera in little pots, you know, on the...
She did paint with two hands.
She painted with both hands at the same time, yes.
Yeah.
After all, it's like playing piano, you do it with both hands. Yeah. But it's unusual to see it.
No, I read that she was able to do this and to do this.
Yes.
Yes.
Mirror writing.
Yes,
Yeah.
mirror
That's why she
writing
was expelled.
with both hands,
But we're not answering
which is
the
really evil.
No, it's true.
We're not answering the
Yeah.
proper question, sorry.
But I think that, I mean, obviously she thought, well, I say obviously, you know, that many of the way the Catholic Church is run is just, you know, the way Catholicism had developed. She was very opposed to, obviously, a misogynistic religion, which is how she, and indeed how I would see Catholicism. But she was somebody who, I think it would be fair to say that she, and I sort of tried to mention this a bit in what I was saying, she was not someone who would ever believe that the truth was in one place. She thought, but I think she was, because she was a searcher, she was interested in looking at, well, what might be true in this faith, what might be true in that faith. And she did say, she at one point said that Buddhism was the only place, the place, she said that she'd never felt she belonged in any faith, but Buddhism was the place that she maybe most felt she believed. But then I found a quote where another time she'd said Gnosticism was that place. So she, at different times in her life, was connected to different faith systems and looked for the things. But certainly, yeah. But of course, Catholicism did really colour her whole life because she found herself in very Catholic societies. And of course, Mexico, you know, she'd grown up in this Catholic household, these convents in Britain, and then in Ireland. My great aunt, who was her aunt, also Leonora, was a sister of charity, a very big figure, Aunt Leo in my family, a very strong nun who stood up to one of those archbishops who later was found to be one of the big bad archbishops, you know, and we know about some of the crimes and terrible things that have happened in the Catholic Church. My great Aunt Leo was already on his case long before anybody else, and I think that in our family, you know, that particularly Aunt Leo, this idea of the nun as not the handmaiden of the church, but the person who was standing up for what was right was very strong. And my aunt is a Carmelite nun, that's Leonora's cousin. So there was all that Catholicism through childhood, and then of course in Italy, she spent time in Florence, and she spent time, as we've mentioned, in Spain and in Portugal, and that would have been the Salazar years. So the Catholicism of Lisbon must have been very oppressive and significant. And then, of course, she gets to Mexico, and Mexico is, yeah. And I often think that Mexico and Ireland are such similar places where the veil between what we can see and believe in this sphere and the unknown and the unseen, they're very close in both these societies, both in Ireland and in Mexico. And of course, it was complete chance, if you believe in chance, how Leonora ended up in Mexico. It wasn't planned. She just, by chance, met this Mexican man, and he said, if you want to get away, I've got the way. Marry me and we'll go to Mexico. And then even when she went to New York with him, she could have left him. There was no reason to carry on. She got to America by then. She could have stayed there. And indeed, her work was doing quite well in Mexico in 1942. She was exhibiting. She was beginning to exhibit. Peggy Guggenheim was about to put her in her show that she was moving towards doing, 31 women. So everything was going well, but as usual, as I said earlier, the one thing you can rely on Leonora to do is shoot herself in the foot. So she wasn't just going to stay. Her career could have panned out very differently, I think, if she'd stayed in New York. But the way I feel why she went to Mexico is, I feel like she was on this adventure and there was one more bit of it to go, and that was to Mexico. And then in Mexico, she found herself in this society, as I say, with this place that was very similar to places from the past, particularly Ireland.
I think the Catholicism affected her sense of the everyday miraculous. I think there's some aspects of Catholicism that she really, truly, consciously and forcefully rejected. She rejected its conventions, its morality, its attitudes to women above all, and she rejected, interestingly, pretty much throughout her work, the idea of the sacrificial as being redemptive, because in her work, when things are sacrificed or killed, it's a sort of, she's not happy with, I mean, she wants this somehow to be reversed. She doesn't want this to be, if you think of a Catholic writer like Georges Bataille, and the place of the sacrificial and the body in his work, and then think about Leonora, you can see the difference between that, the sort of the tremendous exaltation of the destruction of the body in Bataille, and then compared to her celebration of vegetables and their life. So it's a very different sensibility. I think in her novel, The Hearing Trumpet, you could do a very good. I mean, maybe I'll try and do it. One could write a very good essay about its Catholic imagery. I mean, not only does it have this sort of absolutely patent story of Mary Magdalene in it, but it has the whole idea of the old woman and the transformation there, and Mary, and as you said, the Virgin Mary and so forth. So I think there one sees how her imagination and the structures of her thinking have roots in her Catholic upbringing. But it's definitely a position of resistance, a position of trying to go beyond it, of not accepting it. So it's transgressive. She is above all transgressive.
Okay, I think that if there are no... yes, okay, okay.
Thank you so much. I have just one very short question. Since you were just speaking about the rejection of Catholicism, the very strong provocational stance she took, Leonora did, I was wondering, thinking about potential parallels to the artist Niki de Saint-Phal, and I was wondering how you felt about making a parallel between these two artists, and whether Leonora knew about Niki de Saint-Phal and what her opinion was of her art.
I don't know. I don't know if she knew Niki, but I completely agree there's an affinity, definitely. And that's actually a word I haven't used yet, and which is that she's playful. Playful, yes. And so that's that same feminism that is inflected by a sense of joy and playfulness. They certainly share that.
Maybe Niki de Saint-Phal was a little bit more violent.
Yes.
Playful, but also violent. I mean, more provoking somehow. Less childlike.
I would say that in terms of other artists, the other artists who she talked about were the artists she knew. And actually, I remember I was always asking her what she thought of Hockney, and she'd say, I don't know who Hockney is. I don't know his work.
Really?
She didn't know him, but that's what she meant, really. So Remedios Varo and the other artists who were there in Mexico, and of course the ones that she'd known in Paris. That circle, the surrealist circle who were in Paris, they were friends. They were the people she knew, and I don't know how much. I mean, she was interested, obviously, in the work of other artists, but I don't know that. I mean,
well, she spoke a lot about Remedios,
yeah,
and she was really close to her, and she really loved Remedios. And she was utterly bereft when she so suddenly died, rather young.
Yeah.
And she's, as you know, and she's in the show, she's a very considerable artist.
Mm.
But there are themes in common. And the other artist who she knew quite well and she saw in France was Leonora Fini.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, you know, I think the horse painting on the cupboard, I think that's by both of them.
Yeah,
If you look at the body, look at the body, it's not a Carrington body, that.
And there's another
Carrington never
painting
does
to show you
sexualized
that.
bodies like that.
Yeah, no,
Whereas Leonora Fini does.
yeah,
So I think the head, and they had, you know, Whitney Chadwick's last book, I forget what it's called. Roger, what's it called? You published it. You have to, The Militant Muse, thanks so much, thank you. Whitney Chadwick wrote this marvelous book called The Militant Muse because she found a lot of letters between Carrington and Fini. And they had a much more intense relationship and a much more longer relationship than I had previously known from other accounts, and which involved a lot of collaboration.
yeah.
Leonora posed for her, and so I think that's a two-hander. That painting.
And there's another painting as well that I'll show you another time that may also be.
Yes.
And of course, well, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody knows how long Leonora Fini was in the house in France, and it all ended very badly with this row and her leaving very suddenly. So maybe the art didn't become the story, if you see what I mean, because it was this, big fallout.
But to go back to Remedios Varo, they shared a lot of intellectual thinking together about the continuity of phenomena, the origins of, a lot of Remedios's, unfortunately I haven't yet seen the show, so I'm not so well up in what's there, but when she where you see the cosmic wool in which someone is knitting the world, where someone else is creating birds out of musical staves, this sense of the continuity of life passing from form to form. I think, Remedios Varo was very, very sort of deeply engaged with that. And another important influence at this point on their thinking is that Benjamin Perret, who was completely skint and had no money at all, wrote for money an extraordinary book, which should I long for it to be published in English, it hasn't been, on the myths and legends of Latin America. And he went through, he did an immense labor in which he went through the Jesuit archives of the missionaries, all collecting the local Indian stories of cosmology, of the origins of the world, of eggs and so forth. And I think that book, with all this amazing amounts of material that is absolutely non-Western and full of concepts of the cosmic harmony of all things, and animal spirits. That, I think, Remedios was completely involved in that as well, living with it, and that, I think, fed their visions of a different order of value in creation.
And sometimes you see they must have had a conversation, and then there are two pieces of work, like the one I'm thinking of is Bird Birthing, I think it's called, and there's a painting by Leonora and a painting by Remedios, and they're both about the creation of the birds. And I'm pretty sure that that would have been the chat around the kitchen table, and then they she always liked to say that she didn't collaborate. Her art was, I know she did sometimes, but she liked to say that her art was completely hers. But the conversations, and of course in Paris, where she'd been part of the world of those male surrealists, the conversation had been around like in the Café de Flore and the de Magot, the photograph I showed, that's where the conversation had happened that had led to the creation of the art. That was all part of surrealism. And then when she's in Mexico, in some letters that I found, I think in New York, in the Pierre Matisse collection, the letters that she sent to him, she sort of, I think it's in there, there's also a collection of letters at the Edward James Foundation, but in one of those collections, there's somewhere that she's sort of saying, sort of making fun of, Breton and his mates, they're still in Paris, or they're still in New York, sort of talking about surrealism. But basically she's saying that in this letter, she's not saying it, but I think what she means is she's moved on, and her conversations about art. She doesn't care, basically. She doesn't care what Breton's up to or what Max Ernst's up to or what these other people are up to in New York and Paris, these old places of surrealism, because she's in this new place now and she's just interested in the artists around her kitchen table, and that's Remedios and Cathy Horner and the ideas, and the men as well, Benjamin Perret until he went, and Jose Horner, Cathy's husband, very important as well. So it's again the thing that we were talking about earlier. You know, she was never going to be impressed or drawn to where she thought it was all happening, and she was happy that it was happening there, even though it would never in her lifetime be recognised. Really, that was. So it's like a hidden cell, really, of female surrealist art.
I think we're not saying something that's because it's so obvious that in a way one misses saying it, and that is that of course she was in rebellion against the surrealist concept of woman. Yeah. So yes, because I mean she felt sort of pretty early on that she was being used, that Max was using her. I mean, it's quite clear even in Little Frances where she turns herself into.
In which way was he using her?
Well, as a femme enfant, as a muse, as a sort of wonderful, terrible child who would trigger, you know, this was André Breton's theory of woman, that women were there to trigger and spark, like, you know, little Gisèle Précinos, the poet, and there are other sort of figures of this kind in the surrealist movement before the war, you know, that they would be discovered and they would be catalysts to male dreams. There's a famous collage of, you know, Je ne vois pas la femme cachée dans la forêt. I don't see the woman hidden in the forest, with all the surrealists around with their eyes closed and a naked girl in the middle. So this idea that, you know, you as a surrealist male creator, writers and artists, would be set free, liberated by the kind of native delinquency of the pre-pubertal child. And though Leonora was not pre-pubertal, she was 17 when she met Max Ernst. He was, I think, 47. I always get the dates wrong.
She was 20 and he was 46 when they met and left. But yeah, she was incredibly young.
Yes.
He was the same age as her father.
Yes. So there was that sort of sense, something we would, you know, not think
It's
of.
even. It's quite better than the relationship that Man Ray had with Meret Oppenheim, for example. Like, at least she was not just a model.
Oh,
because
God.
that was a scandal that Meret Oppenheim was the great like figure unless she didn't want to be more than a model.
Yes.
And then as soon as she had some success, everybody left her apart because she was too visible.
Leonora realized, I think, quite early on, would you agree? I mean, she was very young, but in her early 20s, she'd already got the measure of Max Ernst, and
well,
she was
suffered.
moving on.
I mean, the stories are quite anguishing. I mean, she suffered a lot. She really felt, and in Little Frances, she makes two artistic decisions, which are very interesting. One is that she turns herself into a boy, and then the boy grows a horse's head. But this idea that she had a dual nature which wasn't being recognized entirely. But also she turns Max Ernst into Uncle Ubriaco, which is Italian for drunk. Well, I don't need to tell you that, sorry. And so somehow she's got him, you know, he's in the story, he's kind of cruel in his neglect of her and his. So it was not a happy time, and she really escaped from that. And I think that actually, Cheeky Weiss was a different kind of man, actually. Yeah. I think she was happy with him because he wasn't a kind of, he didn't use her in that way. He never took any photographs of her, as far as I know, which is quite extraordinary.
Cheeky. He took some photographs, but they're maybe not distributed as much as.
But anyway, he didn't use her as a kind of nude model.
No, absolutely no, and he wasn't doing that kind of photography. No. Sorry, I've just forgotten what I was going to say. I was just going to say something.
He did not manipulate her in any way.
No, Cheeky didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, Leonora, when I came to study, or came to look at her relationship with Max Ernst, one thing that quite surprised me was the way I know, obviously, about the work of Whitney Chadwick and how absolutely important that was, but all the same, the story still seemed to be in art history that, you know, Max had let her go. She was his floozy, and he'd kind of let her go when the time came. But I really am sure that's not how it was. You know, Max Ernst wanted to stay with her. Jimmy Ernst, who you've mentioned, says quite a few times in his book that he'd never seen his father as in love with that she was the, you know, the great love of his life. And certainly when they moved on to New York, Max Ernst wanted very much to stay with Leonora, and she left him at that point. And I think that was her, you know, that was her realizing that she needed to move on and that she wasn't going to be the junior artist to this male senior artist. Yes. But also it was her just using her power to get out of that relationship. I mean, it must have been hard for her because she cared about him and she knew she was leaving him, and he of course was with Peggy Guggenheim, but he wasn't in love with Peggy.
Well, she worked very hard to get him out of the first prison because he was first arrested as a German, as you said, by the Vichy regime after the war was declared. But she got him out of that prison. She traveled around and talked to people in Paris and tried to use what influence she had, and that was successful. He was allowed out, so he came back to Saint-Martin-d'Ardèche. But then when the occupation started, he was rearrested by the Germans as a degenerate artist, because he'd been in the degenerate artist exhibition. And so that was much more calamitous. I mean, that was much more final. That's when she was left alone in Saint-Martin, sold the house, went mad, and had traveled across the Pyrenees on her own, you know, with a friend who helped her get across the Pyrenees and so forth. It was a terrible, terrible time. Chronicled brilliantly in Down Below, which is one of these amazing examples, very unusual in literature, of somebody chronicling their madness very lucidly. So it's really astonishing that she did it after the event, of course, but she did it first in dictation, and then it was written down and then edited by her and so forth. It has a very complicated history Down Below, but it's an amazing account of a breakdown.
It is, that's absolutely true. I mean, when she left, I feel that even when I knew her in Mexico, all those years later, there was still part of her that felt guilt about having left France when Max Ernst was still there in a prison. Because when she left with that other artist, Catherine Yarrow, she knew that if Max got out of the prison, as indeed he did, and he was very lucky to do that, because, as I said, he was having all his adventures, and he nearly got carted off the other way to Germany, but he managed, through a conversation with someone who helped him, to get on the other train, going the other direction, and he got away. But she knew that if that happened, there was only one place he'd go to, and that was the house. And he would get there, and that's what happened, and he'd get there, and she'd be gone. And when she left that house, she took his passport with her. And she kind of felt that in taking the passport, she was taking him, she was still looking after him. And she also, and I think Catherine Yarrow encouraged this thought, she, as you rightly say, she'd been so influential in getting him out of the prison the first time. And I think Catherine Yarrow, the friend with whom she went off to Spain, said to her, look, Leonora, she obviously didn't want to leave her in the situation she was in, but I think she said, you'll be able to do so much more for Max if we go to Spain. You'll be able to, to argue there for his release. But she was, it seems a funny thing to say in a way because of her leaving her family. I think she had no choice at all than to leave her family. But she was an enormously loyal person. And she would always want to give credit where it was due. And I think that she would say that she learned a lot from Max Ernst, and also that he got her into the phase of her life. There were many times in her life, weren't there, when she was at a threshold or she was moving into something very important, next stage. But I think the point at which she leaves her country, leaves the country where she's been born, leaves the family she's been born into, and goes to Paris to join the Surrealists, that is probably the crucial moment when she really breaks away. And Max Ernst enabled that, let's say. And I feel like she would always acknowledge that, even though she couldn't stay with him.
But I think in terms of the relationship to the exhibition and its themes, this idea of the kind of internal androgyny. You know, even if your body is female, that you have an internally androgynous soul or spirit, also projected into animals and so forth, that your spirit is mobile. I think that is a very strong, important aspect of her work. And when André Breton commissioned the artists, you know, he was very helpful in getting the artists and writers who were in flight in New York working again. And there were several publications, excellent publications. And in one of them, he commissioned an alphabet. And she chose for the alphabet l'androgyne, the androgyne. And it's called l'âme androgyne, the soul, androgynous soul, my sister, ma sœur. So I think this is an important motif in her life. I mean, the self-portrait is ambiguous in gender because she's dressed as for riding, and so she looks, and she's straddling. You know, it's the exact opposite of any kind of maidenly picture of a girl of that age from her class at the time. So there's this sense of, and all through her work, I think there's a kind of, the fluidity of self becomes a fluidity of gender, which of course again is one of these prophetic aspects of her imagination.
Yeah, definitely. Although I think that the relationship with Max Ernst was incredibly complicated. I mean, it was like a young boy with an old man,
yes,
also,
yes,
like
yes. Like a
Greek style.
Yes,
if you
exactly,
want,
yes.
like, one helping the other, but then having some trouble in splitting apart, because of course
Yes.
the mutual dependency was great.
Yes.
It took
Actually, Leonore Feeney painted Carrington in this period as a Joan of Arc. She paints her in armor.
Somebody else?
Hi. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you for this wonderful discussion. It's really interesting listening to all of these insights about this, this conversation. So my question is related to Leonora's relationship with the society of the time. So essentially, the society she grew up in was the rise of the mechanical age, the effects of industrialization on society, and so forth. So essentially, what's the relationship, between her art and the society in which she lived in? How does her art reflect that? Or rather, maybe was her art an escape from that? Thank you.
I think that her art was reflected, as I think I said, her early times. I think she arrived in Mexico, which is obviously where she produced the vast majority, apart from those years in New York, of her art. She arrived in Mexico with a huge amount of baggage, if you like. So much had happened to her, and that comes out on her canvases through particularly those early years. I mean, personally, I feel like the 1940s are her great period as a painter, because I think those paintings are extraordinary. And I feel like she's unpacking those worlds. But then when you move on to the 60s and the 70s, her work changes. They tend not to be those early works. There's all these different worlds interwoven. The paintings of the 60s and 70s appear more straightforward, like the painting Grandmother Moorhead's Aromatic Kitchen, which Marina showed. But I think that she went into a period then when she very much was reflecting the issues that she cared about. For example, she was living in Mexico City in Mexico at a time when the population was hugely exploding. It was a time of massive population increase, and she was very worried about that, about what it meant for the whole of the world that the population was increasing so much. And there's at least one painting I can think of where the female figure is holding a pill, and that's the pill. I mean, that's her thinking about contraception, which is something that she thought about. That she wanted women to be empowered, obviously, in how they could control having children, and also she became very interested in her midlife. We've heard about this through her literature. She became very interested in the idea of later life. And so there's a painting, for example, that I'm thinking of now, which is a group of three, they're often a group of three women in her paintings. I mean, there are many, many women, many figures that might be a woman, or might be a horse, or might be a woman, or might be a tree. But sometimes there are figures with three female human people. And this painting I'm thinking of has three older women, and they're on a street which is probably Mexico City, because it's the Mexico City soon after the 1985 earthquake, and the pavements are fractured as they would have been by the earthquake, and the fractures in the pavement are repeated in the lines on the faces of the people. So in essence, yes, I think she was absolutely using what was going on around her, but I think she did that more later on. That would be my impression.
That's very interesting about the earthquake. I hadn't made the connection, because she had this love of the subterranean. That's probably, first of all, it was a figurative love of what can't be seen, so what is sort of beyond visibility, but also this fear of being above, which was probably fed by the prevalence of earthquakes, and the very serious earthquake, yes.
I mean, one thing that I think is really important to sort of say about her is that she was very congruent, as we've both said, and that extended to not always saying the same thing at different times, and there being these conflicts in herself. But she was very honest about that, wasn't she? You know, she, as you rightly say, she was always afraid of flying, but she did sometimes fly, actually. For her 90th birthday, she flew to Florida with her family.
Did she really?
Yes. So there are very few things that you can completely pin her down and say, she never did this, or she never did that, or she...
But it is actually astonishing to take the bus to Mexico City.
Yeah,
I mean,
that is.
it really is. It's a very long journey. And of course, it's also the journey which is made by all the paperless, undocumented workers who keep the American economy going.
Yeah.
And that's how they go.
Yeah.
So she was with them, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can thank you and thank the public. It has been a very intense discussion, and so I hope that Cecilia is happy with the start of her program, this interesting, very interesting program of talks. And thank you, everybody. I repeat what Cecilia has already said. This afternoon at 5 o'clock, there will be another meeting. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.